I had always thought my building was quiet, predictably so, like the rhythm of an old clock. People came and went, small greetings exchanged in passing, but nothing more. That evening, however, everything felt different. The air in the hallway carried a faint tension, a quiet murmur of whispers that made me pause at my door. I noticed the lights flickering softly, warm but dim, and something about the soft shuffle of feet down the corridor made my chest tighten with curiosity. I was on my way to my apartment when the door across the hall creaked open. 3 women, neighbors I knew only casually, stood there, leaning just slightly toward each other, laughter tucked behind their hands. There was Mara, tall and graceful with streaks of silver in her hair that shimmered under the light. Celine, petite but commanding in presence, with sharp, curious eyes. And Viola, whose quiet smile held a kind of gentle warmth that could put anyone at ease. They looked at me, and, for a moment, their laughter faded, replaced by something different. Expectation, perhaps, or the thrill of shared secrets. "You should come over," Mara said, her voice soft but teasing. "We have something to show you." I hesitated. There was no invitation in their previous interactions that hinted at this kind of intimacy. I opened my mouth, unsure what to say, but Celine's eyes, bright and teasing, made it impossible to refuse. "Just for a little while," she added, as if reading my hesitation. I followed them down the narrow corridor, my heartbeat quickening. The air smelled faintly of vanilla and fresh linen, a mix that was comforting yet vaguely intoxicating. Each step closer felt like stepping into another world. Soft rugs muffled our footsteps, and the low hum of a heater combined with their light laughter created a cocoon of warmth. Inside, their apartment was dimly lit with candles, casting golden patches of light across the walls. The space was cozy, intimate, yet strangely charged. I noticed how they arranged themselves on the sofa, deliberately close but not overwhelming, leaving just enough space to draw me in. Their touches were fleeting, Mara's hand brushing mine as she offered me a drink, Viola gently guiding me to a chair with her hand resting lightly on my back. But every gesture carried warmth, a silent familiarity I hadn't expected. As I settled, I couldn't help but notice the subtle details. The way their eyes flickered to me when they thought I wasn't looking, the quiet lilt in their voices when they spoke to one another, and the sense of a private rhythm I was suddenly part of. I realized then that this was no ordinary visit. This was a beginning, an invitation not just into their apartment, but into something unspoken, a world where the ordinary rules didn't quite apply. And in that moment, I felt it, the strange, thrilling pull of curiosity, the gentle hum of anticipation that made me lean in slightly closer than necessary, as if drawn by invisible threads toward a secret I wasn't sure I was ready to uncover. The moment I stepped fully into their apartment, I realized I was no longer just a visitor. There was an energy in the room, playful, yet charged with an intimacy that felt deliberate. The 3 women had arranged the furniture to create a circle, leaving an inviting space at the center. Mara's silver-streaked hair caught the candlelight as she gestured toward the empty spot. "Sit," she said softly, almost commandingly, yet there was a teasing lilt in her tone that made me hesitate for only a heartbeat before obeying. Celine, with her piercing gaze, leaned slightly forward, resting her chin in her hand. "We have a game," she said, her voice calm but carrying an undertone that made my pulse quicken. "A game to get to know each other, more than usual." I swallowed, my curiosity battling a sudden nervous flutter. Their smiles were warm, inviting, but there was a deliberate tension in their movements, a subtle choreography of proximity and attention. Viola, the gentlest of the 3, handed me a small card, its edges smooth under my fingers. "This is the first challenge," she murmured, her fingers brushing mine just long enough for the warmth to linger, sending a ripple of awareness through my chest. The rules were simple but intimate. We would take turns sharing stories, answering questions, or performing little dares, tasks that seemed harmless, yet carried a weight I couldn't fully measure. I felt my heart thumping not just from the novelty, but from the closeness of their presence. Mara's hand occasionally rested near mine on the sofa arm. Celine leaned just a fraction closer than necessary when she spoke, and Viola's soft glances followed me like a gentle echo. As the first round began, their laughter filled the room, soft, melodic, almost conspiratorial. Each question or challenge drew me out of my comfort zone. "Tell us something no one else knows about you," Celine prompted, her eyes scanning mine with a mixture of curiosity and playful insistence. I hesitated, aware of the delicate energy between us. But when I spoke, their reactions were immediate. Soft smiles, nods of understanding, gentle teasing that didn't humiliate, but drew me further into their orbit. The intimacy was quiet, almost imperceptible to an outsider. A shoulder brushed mine, a hand lingered on a knee while helping me settle, or a finger lightly grazed my wrist during a particularly tense or amusing moment. The tactile details, the warmth of their touch, the softness of their movements, the scent of their perfume mingling with the faint smell of the candles, created a cocoon that made the apartment feel entirely separate from the world outside. Even as the game remained playful, there was a subtle, unspoken question in every glance and gesture. How much would I allow myself to feel? The teasing, the warmth, and the closeness were intoxicating, and I realized I was both terrified and thrilled at being drawn into their rhythm. By the time the first round ended, I knew that this game was far more than entertainment. It was a deliberate, delicate exploration of trust, desire, and the quiet pull of human connection. And though the rules were simple, I sensed the layers beneath. Each touch, each look, each pause was a test, not of skill, but of willingness. The real challenge, I realized, was surrendering to the gravity of their presence without losing myself. By the time the second round of the game ended, the playful tension had softened into something more intimate, something quietly profound. The laughter lingered in the corners of the apartment, but beneath it was a current of honesty, of unspoken vulnerability that made the air feel warmer, denser, almost alive. I noticed small things I hadn't before. Mara's gentle exhale when she shared a memory, the subtle tremor in Viola's fingers as she reached for her tea, Celine's eyes glinting with unspoken stories as she traced the rim of her glass. They began sharing pieces of themselves, truths they hadn't told many, if any. Mara spoke of a loss she carried quietly, her voice steady but soft, and I found myself leaning in, aware of the way her arm brushed against mine as she gestured, the warmth lingering longer than necessary. Celine recounted an adventure from her younger years, her words animated, yet her hand occasionally pressed gently to her chest, as if guarding the memory. Viola's story was quieter, almost shy, yet her eyes never left mine, holding a steady vulnerability that made the apartment feel cocooned, safe. For the first time, I offered my own stories, not the polished, casual ones, but those tucked behind layers of hesitation. I talked about loneliness, about uncertainty in relationships, about small regrets that had never been voiced. The women listened with full attention, nodding, smiling, sometimes laughing softly, their hands or fingers occasionally brushing mine in a gesture that felt both comforting and deliberate. Each touch was subtle but meaningful, a knuckle resting lightly on mine, a shoulder brushing against me as we leaned closer to share a private laugh, a palm lingering near mine on the table. The sensory details of their presence became almost overwhelming in the most beautiful way. Mara's perfume, a soft blend of sandalwood and vanilla, mingled with the faint aroma of tea and the gentle flicker of candlelight. Viola's hair smelled faintly of lavender, brushing against my forearm when she leaned forward to emphasize a point. Celine's warmth radiated subtly from her proximity, the quiet hum of her voice resonating in my chest as she laughed at a story I shared. These small, seemingly incidental touches pulled me deeper into their world, and into a delicate intimacy that was as emotional as it was tactile. By the end of the evening, I realized that the game had become a portal into understanding them, not just their stories, but their humanity. There was a rhythm forming, laughter, pauses, shared glances, and a mutual awareness of the spaces between us. Each woman had her own way of expressing connection, and I found myself responding instinctively, my own gestures soft, tentative, but increasingly unguarded. The evening closed with a quiet ease. The laughter had faded into soft conversation, the candlelight flickered gently, and for a fleeting moment, all three women and I shared a sense of togetherness. The emotional tension had shifted, curiosity and fascination had deepened into empathy, care, and the subtle beginnings of longing. I left their apartment that night aware that something profound had started, not just a game, but a bond, delicate and layered, that would continue to unfold in ways I was only beginning to understand. After a few evenings of the game, I started noticing subtle shifts, not just in how the women interacted with me, but in how I felt. Each time I walked into their apartment, a mix of excitement and hesitation settled in my chest, like a humming current I could neither ignore nor fully control. I was drawn to them, yes, but unsure of the boundaries, of what was allowed, what was safe, and what might feel too much. Mara, Celine, and Viola were more than my neighbors now. They were enigmas, each holding a part of my attention in a different way. Mara's quiet strength and grace made me feel grounded. Her gaze lingered in moments that felt almost electric, her hand brushing my arm when she leaned forward to share a thought. Celine's sharp humor and teasing glances pulled me out of my comfort zone, making my heart race with the thrill of uncertainty. Viola's gentle warmth and attentive presence calmed me, her soft smiles and lingering touches creating a tender tension I hadn't expected. The game had evolved without anyone announcing it. Their challenges now tested my emotional honesty, and I found myself revealing thoughts I'd usually keep private. In response, they would smile knowingly, sometimes resting a hand on mine, sometimes letting their fingers brush my shoulder lightly. Small gestures that seemed casual but made my chest tighten with awareness. Every glance, every brush of skin, carried unspoken questions. How close could we really get? How much of myself could I show before it became too intimate? Walking home after these evenings, my mind replayed each interaction. I wondered if I was reading too much into it, or if the tension was mutual. Every detail, the way Mara's perfume clung faintly to the air after she passed, the soft laugh Celine let slip when I stumbled over a story, Viola's quiet, reassuring presence as she guided me to sit, made me feel simultaneously seen and exposed. The contradictions of desire and caution tangled in my chest, leaving me restless. One evening, during a pause in the game, I caught their eyes meeting mine in a silent exchange. Mara's expression was soft but probing, Celine's teasing yet calculating, Viola's tender yet expectant. I realized I wasn't just navigating my feelings anymore. I was also navigating theirs. The awareness of attraction, mutual yet unspoken, made the room feel smaller, warmer, more electric. I found myself questioning my reactions, the quickened heartbeat when a hand brushed mine, the hesitation before I returned a smile, the involuntary leaning closer during shared stories. I wanted to be honest, to allow myself to respond naturally, yet I also feared the consequences of crossing the unspoken line. It was a delicate balance between fascination and restraint, desire and propriety. By the end of the evening, I understood that the game was no longer just playful. It was revealing something deeper, something about trust, boundaries, and the pull of human connection. The tension between what I felt and what I should feel left me unsettled, but also profoundly alive. I was caught between hesitation and longing, unsure where the game ended and where the real, subtle attraction began. The evening began like so many others, but I could feel the subtle difference the moment I stepped into their apartment. There was a charged quiet in the air, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. The candlelight flickered softly, casting long, golden shadows that danced across the furniture, highlighting the warmth of the room and the warmth of their presence. Mara, Celine, and Viola were arranged in the same circle as before, but the space between us seemed smaller somehow, more intimate, more deliberate. The game had taken a new turn tonight. Each of us would share something deeply personal, something that felt raw and unpolished. Mara's voice led the first round, steady yet quivering with the weight of the memory she shared, an old loss she had carried silently for years. I felt my chest tighten as her story unfolded, my own empathy reflected in the subtle shift of her hand brushing against mine as she emphasized a detail. The touch was light but deliberate, a whisper of comfort, and it sent a flutter of awareness through me that I couldn't ignore. Celine followed, recounting a daring adventure from her youth, her words lively and animated. I laughed along with her, but my laughter faltered slightly when her hand briefly grazed my shoulder as she emphasized a point. That fleeting warmth lingered, making the apartment feel smaller, the air thicker, as if every movement was magnified. Viola shared last, her story quiet, soft, but laced with a vulnerability that made me lean in instinctively. When her fingers brushed mine as she passed a cup of tea, I felt the steady pulse of her presence in a way that was almost tactile. When it came to my turn, I hesitated. My thoughts, usually contained and cautious, now felt uncontainable. I spoke of my loneliness, the uncertainty I felt in relationships, the quiet struggles that had never reached anyone's ears. As I spoke, their attention was absolute. Mara's gaze softened, Celine's eyes sparkled with unspoken understanding, and Viola's hand found mine, her touch grounding me, reminding me that this space was safe. Each gentle contact, the brief pressure of a hand on my arm, the warmth of shoulders brushing, felt laden with meaning. The room seemed suspended in that delicate balance between revelation and comfort, tension and ease. Laughter, when it appeared, was soft and shared, almost shy, but the intimacy beneath it hummed quietly, unbroken. I noticed how close we had unconsciously leaned together, shoulders touching, hands brushing, breaths mingling in the soft candlelight. The emotional weight of our honesty made every gesture resonate. By the end of the evening, a profound sense of connection had settled over us. The playful teasing and subtle games had evolved into something far deeper: trust, understanding, and a quiet longing that lingered between glances and touches. I realized that this was the emotional peak, not the height of romance in the traditional sense, but the apex of intimacy, vulnerability, and unspoken desire. The game had opened a door, and I had stepped through, fully aware of the gravity, yet exhilarated by it. As we all sat together in comfortable silence, the warmth of the room and each other enveloping me, I felt something irreversible shift. This was no longer about a simple game. It was about connection, closeness, and the subtle pull of hearts recognizing each other's presence. And in that moment, I knew the path forward would be just as delicate, just as thrilling, and infinitely more personal. The game eventually slowed, its edges softening into conversation that no longer needed rules. By then, the candles had burned lower, their glow gentler, the air heavy with a warmth that came as much from closeness as from heat. I noticed how our laughter had grown quieter, how words were exchanged in softer tones, as though we were afraid to break the delicate thread binding us together. It was in these quieter spaces that the confessions began. Mara was the first, her voice steady, yet edged with something that betrayed its vulnerability. She admitted how lonely the evenings sometimes felt, how the silence of her apartment pressed against her, even when she filled it with music. As she spoke, she leaned just slightly toward me, her hand brushing mine on the cushion between us. The touch was fleeting, but it stayed long enough to feel deliberate, long enough to send a current through me that made my breath catch. Celine's turn followed, and hers carried a different kind of truth. She admitted that she often masked her fears with humor, that her teasing was sometimes a shield. Her eyes, usually so sharp and playful, softened as she said it, her voice lower, more hesitant. She rested her hand lightly against my forearm as if to anchor herself, and I felt the weight of that gesture. Small, human, profoundly intimate. Viola's confession was quieter still, her words almost a whisper. She spoke of the weight of expectations, of trying to be dependable for everyone else, while never fully letting herself be vulnerable. When she lifted her eyes to mine, there was a rawness there that unsettled me. She reached forward, fingers brushing a stray lock of hair from my forehead in a gesture so tender it felt like it belonged to a world far more private than the one we occupied. I found myself unable to stay silent. Their honesty pulled mine forward. I confessed my own fears, that I often felt unmoored, unsure of where I fit, that I worried about giving too much of myself away to people who wouldn't keep it safe. My voice wavered in a way I hadn't expected, but none of them looked away. Mara's hand found my knee briefly, grounding me. Celine gave a small nod, her lips tugging into the faintest, reassuring smile. Viola's fingers, resting against the side of my wrist, remained there, steady and quiet. The air felt different after that, thicker, more charged, yet more comfortable than before. The silence wasn't empty. It was full, humming with unspoken recognition. Shoulders leaned together naturally, bodies angled closer without thought. The rhythm of breathing, laughter, and pauses created a kind of music all its own, something fragile yet deeply binding. By the end of the night, we weren't playing anymore. We were simply sitting together, sharing warmth, sharing presence, sharing pieces of ourselves that didn't often see the light. And in the glow of those quiet confessions, I realized that what bound us was no longer a secret game. It was something deeper: trust, tenderness, and a quiet longing that words couldn't quite hold. By the time the final evening of the game arrived, there was no mistaking it. Something had shifted between us. What began as a playful invitation had grown into something layered, intimate, and fragile in the best way. The rules of the game no longer mattered. We didn't need dares or cards to draw us closer. It happened naturally, as though the very air in the apartment conspired to keep us within reach of one another. The apartment was quiet that night. The candles burned lower, their lights steady and calm, and the city's hum outside felt distant, softened by the cocoon of warmth we had built. We didn't sit in a strict circle anymore. Mara had settled comfortably at my side on the sofa, her presence solid and reassuring. Celine sprawled casually across the armrest nearby, her elbow brushing the back of my shoulder whenever she shifted. Viola sat cross-legged on the rug, close enough that her knee touched mine lightly when she leaned forward. We were no longer carefully arranged. We were simply together. Conversation flowed easily, punctuated by laughter that felt more natural than ever. Yet in the spaces between words, I noticed the most: the quiet rhythm of Mara's hand resting lightly against mine, the way Celine's gaze softened when she caught me looking at her, the quiet steadiness of Viola's shoulder leaning gently into my leg. Each touch was small, almost ordinary, but together they carried a weight that filled the room with meaning. There was no single confession that night, no grand revelation. Instead, there was a sense of recognition, a silent acknowledgement that what we had found was real, even if undefined. Mara's silver hair brushed my cheek when she leaned close to murmur something quietly. Celine, usually teasing, allowed her voice to soften, her hand lingering a little longer on my arm. Viola's gentle presence wrapped around me like a steady warmth, her laughter carrying the tenderness of someone who no longer needed to hide. I realized I wasn't caught between them, not really. There was no competition, no choice to be made. What bound us together wasn't about claiming or being claimed. It was about presence, about finding something rare in the simple act of sharing a space where honesty lived. Each of them, in their own way, had given me something precious: Mara's strength, Celine's daring spirit, Viola's quiet compassion. And in return, I had given them my attention, my sincerity, my willingness to be vulnerable. When the night grew late, silence settled easily among us. I felt their warmth near me, the brush of Mara's hand resting firmly on mine, Celine's head leaning briefly against my shoulder, Viola's fingers intertwining with mine, just for a moment. It was enough. We didn't need words to explain what it meant. As I walked back to my apartment, I carried that warmth with me. It wasn't just the memory of touches or glances, but the realization that I was no longer alone in the quiet halls of this building. What started as a secret game had become something much more: an unspoken bond, delicate yet steady, reminding me that sometimes the deepest connections are built not in grand gestures, but in small, lingering moments shared in the glow of trust.